All right, it sounds like that's my cue to get us started, right, Antonio? All right, we're gonna dive right into it. We're at the end of 2 fantastic days of invigorating, inspiring conversations, and I'm joined here by 2 esteemed leaders in the global philanthropy, finance, and implementation space. And so we're just gonna kick things off. I think we have about 25 minutes of a conversation, and then hopefully we'll send you off with lots of inspiration and action. We've been hearing quite a bit about the intersection of the green economy, just transition, gender inequality around the globe, and today lots of conversations around ESG, the role of financing. And so we're going to take a little 360 view of the role of inequality in advancing our sustainable development goals. And Mark, I'm going to kick off with you. You've been at this for quite some time. Share with us a little bit of that historical perspective. What have you noticed in terms of how we've been approaching the inequality discussion? And talk to us a little bit about that tension between poverty and inequality.
Well, it was always much easier in the sort of international organization world that I was then in to deal with poverty than inequality. There was a broad coalition of governments which would support an attack on poverty, which kind of got discomforted and disrupted when you moved the discussion on to inequality. But the fact is, the two are deeply related, and the poverty reduction that we saw, imperfect though it was, has largely stalled because inequality has started to pick up its pace again with, most recently during the COVID period when extraordinary fortunes were unsurprisingly made, even as the world itself economically shrank, just further maldistributed growth. So we now are in a situation where inequality is increasing, where poverty is growing again. A World Bank predicted that instead of the 3% of extreme poverty by 2030 that was anticipated, it'll be back up to 7%. And now I borrow a very good Oxfam statistic that during this COVID period, 26 cents in every dollar of global GDP that was created, new cents, 26 cents of that dollar went to the top 1% of the world's population. So, we're in this dangerous place where both indicators are going the wrong way.
Danny, do you agree with Mark's observation? Tell us a little bit about how you all have been approaching this. 90 countries. You guys have been around for 80 years, I believe. Share with us your perspective, what you've seen just over the past several decades.
Yeah, so Oxfam is actually 80 years old this month.
Oh, wow. Congrats.
Thank you. And we were founded and spent almost all of our existence fighting poverty. If you look at our strap lines and our slogans over almost all of our history, it's been about poverty. If you look today, you'll see much more prominent messaging and concerns about inequality. Because just as Mark said, we can't end poverty without tackling inequality. And in some ways, poverty exists today, famine exists today, not because of scarcity, but because of maldistribution. And here we are, 2 years into a global pandemic that, many people said at the start of this pandemic that this would be the great leveler, that we're all in this together, we could all get infected and humanity will come together. But just as Marcus said, we've gone the complete opposite direction. 99% of us on this planet are less well off than we would have been otherwise as a result of this global pandemic. But what's happened at the top? The extremely wealthy have accumulated eye-watering amounts. The world's 10 richest men, they're all men, have seen their wealth more than double in the last 2 years. There have been 62 new billionaires created in the pandemic era who've made their money from food or energy, just at a time when the vast majority of people on the planet are grappling with rising food and energy prices. So this is a real problem. It's out of control, and my fear is we're sleepwalking into an inequality crisis.
You said that perfectly, sleepwalking into an inequality crisis. How do we think about addressing these issues from a structural standpoint. We heard so many stories, saw this data from the World Bank where 70% of 10-year-olds are unable to read or write simple text, and that the economic loss of that is amounting to close to $21 trillion of lost income over the next several decades. What are some of the systemic, sort of structural issues we need to be tackling in order to move us in that direction? Mark, you look like you want to chime in here.
I will, but I'm sure Danny will have a very good contribution on it too. But I mean, I just think that, in a way, I think there is a values and political will piece, which is that this level of inequality, I think we'll look back on it with almost the same abhorrence we apply to looking back at slavery. A sense that how on earth could we have indulged such an unjust social system that allowed this degree of inequality. And I think the solutions will come, both from the same kind of campaigning and conscience raising that ended slavery, and a lot of people in this room will be engaged in that, but also then from the sort of international laws and institutions that were used to abolish slavery both nationally and globally. I think we have to reach a point where there is an understanding across all political barriers in the world that this level of inequality is not just unjust, but actually unfair to everybody, rich and poor alike, because it makes a society which is so clearly operating on half speed that it's just not meeting its full potential. And I think we're a long way from that moment of global solidarity, either politically, let alone securing the institutions to end it.
I mean, two things. I think one would be where the last panel left off, which is around regulation. Mm-hmm. We've had a few decades of a race to the bottom when it comes to global cooperation on things like tax, on tax havens, and I think there was a sort of naive assumption that globalization would be the great leveler, that somehow we'll all plug into the global economy, goods, services, data will move, and that will eventually lead to greater equality, but the opposite is happening. And we need to get much, much better at regulating at the national level, but importantly, at the supranational level.
Do you think we can actually legislate ourselves into equality? I mean, earlier today, there was a comment on a previous panel talking about the pace of legislation to future-proof sort of the players in our ecosystem. Do you think that that's actually possible? I live in the United States, and the division there from a legislative standpoint is so rife. You wonder sometimes, will we ever get to consensus? So I'm curious as to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, I think you can. Look, we saw at the G7 summit last year an early agreement around a lowest agreed corporate taxation rate. It was lower than we'd like it to have been, but that was an important statement that governments, major economies, recognize they can't just keep out-competing each other as to who's going to have a lower tax rate. That's one. But the second, as Mark says, is this is also about investing in people's power. This is the wake-up call to all of us who believe in a more just and equal world, that we have to stand up and fight for these things. They won't come. You can't expect legislation to just sort of appear, but we need to build back that muscle, and that, especially the sort of global connective tissue, to have that resurgent people power that demands a far more equal world, a more radically better world.
I mean, it's the case that we always tend to think that it's the Western countries that don't tax the rich enough. If you look at tax revenue in developing countries, it's more often than not a much smaller portion of the GDP, because there isn't a capacity to apply an income tax and other direct taxes effectively across populations which are not used to paying tax. So, you rely on sales tax and import taxes. And so, getting to a much more comprehensive global tax base is going to be a critical part of this. That does include taxing the very rich a lot more than they are taxed now, but it's around also helping governments just with their revenue raising capacities and strategies, because, you know, this ultimately, everybody everywhere has to pay their share if we're to get to a world with the, you know, the right values of fairness and redistribution in them. And I think we've all learned that doesn't take us down the road to a socialist economy in the way that was looked at, you know, some generations ago. But it does take us down the road to recognizing that every person's labor has a value, and one person's labor's value is rarely going to be 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 times that of another. And if you don't get to a sense of shared equity, where certainly people are paid based on their talent, but nevertheless there is this sense that enough is enough at one end and too little is too little at the other end, unless that sort of sense of social contract and social solidarity is there, you know, the world is going to come off the rails.
I mean, it feels like we're in that direction. You know, thinking about sort of the role of philanthropy. Mark, you're with OSF, and you know, the economist and author Dambisa Moyo, when she wrote her book Dead Aid, she talked about the malignancy of aid. You know, how are you approaching, as a private foundation, this notion that we can charity our way or aid our way out of this inequality issue?
Well, you know, in a way, of philanthropy is sort of free of Dambisa's attack in a way, because, you know, at the time I was running the UN development program, so I got it between the eyes from her on that. And you know, she has half a point that these institutions, you know, may unintentionally prolong a kind of dependency. They may replicate old economic structures. But I can tell you, for every kid who got some support to get through school, or every mother who got some help to have affordable meals, it didn't look that bad. Development assistance. I think for a foundation like I run now, OSF, you know, on the one hand, we are the product of a great fortune being made. We are the product of a massively unequal capitalist success by our founder. He's a rather unusual founder because he's critical of the markets, which allowed him to make that fortune. But you know, we use our money differently we don't use it as aid. We use it to try and spur change, where we find change agents anywhere in the world who care as much as we do about justice and human rights and open societies. You know, we'll put some money behind them to help, and we think our legitimacy comes, you know, not from where our money came from, but the impact of what we do. And if we're transparent about that and people see that we're on the side of change, you know, I hope we'll get a good press for it from Thomson Reuters and others.
Yeah, well, there we go. Danny, do you have a perspective on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, philanthropy is important. Oxfam has been around for 80 years. In this country alone, we've raised something like £12 billion over the last 80 years in today's money, almost all from everyday people, but not high net worth individuals, but people who believe in an internationalism, in an international solidarity. But philanthropy is not enough. And you know, one of the most exciting partners we work with are called Patriotic Millionaires. Look them up. Amazing group of very rich people across the world who are calling for higher taxes. Because they're saying, we've made it, you know, we're lucky, we've made good, but that's not good enough.
There's a great article about one in particular in the New York Times this past weekend, I believe. And on that point, we've been talking a little bit about what's not working with a view towards some of the ideas around how we can improve, but let's dig into a couple of stories or examples of hope. You're in countries all the time. You were just sharing you were coming back from Somalia, is that right? You know, share with us what you're seeing working on the ground, Danny.
Well, I think coming back to the sort of structural level, we publish a report every couple of years called the Commitment to Reducing Inequality Index, and we look at actions by countries around the world to reduce inequality. The bad news is, over the last 2 years, about half of the world's countries have ended up spending less on things like social protection, despite the fact that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. But the good news is, and this is Mark's point, there are some fascinating examples. Tajikistan has introduced a much more progressive personal income tax system. Bhutan has introduced a new progressive sales tax. Egypt has introduced a new national minimum wage. There are lots of examples where countries are leaning into policies that will drive towards equality and fairness rather than inequality.
Mark, any thoughts on sort of these ripples of hope or examples of hope that we're seeing?
No, I mean, one bad one, then one good one. I was also in East Africa last week, and, a lot of people said to me, what's the most violent war in the world? Now, fortunately, I've spent enough of my career in Africa not to be tripped up by that one, because it is the Ethiopian Tigray conflict at the moment, which has cost almost certainly 600,000 lives over the course of this year, 100,000 in direct military casualties, 500,000 in displacement, famine, public health consequences. But, most readers of newspapers around the world wouldn't know that. They would instantly say Ukraine, which is a devastating and tragic conflict. Don't get me wrong, but the imbalance in terms of, sort of understanding where world suffering is located is key. So, for me, the good news points are governments, but more particularly people in many parts of the world, simply taking control of their destinies in more effective ways. And even if we see democracy and human rights both actually doing very badly over the last 15 years, not unrelated to this rise in inequality, what one also sees is extraordinary communities, individuals and others who are just determined to resist that. So it's a sort of mixed news. It's not saying there's great victories, but it's saying there are very brave people out there fighting for human rights and fighting to be heard.
So I'm getting the timer that we have less than 3 minutes left. So within those 3 minutes, let's leave this very multifaceted audience with a couple of action steps. What's your hope for the next couple of years as we try to move towards some bridging that gap in inequality in order to advance on these Sustainable Development Goals? What would you say to the corporates in the room, the NGOs in the room, the activists in the room? Three actions you think they need to be taking.
I've got 16, but I'll stick with 3. No, I think, look...
And you have a minute.
There's a crisis in inequality, but there's also a crisis of democracy. And every one of us has a duty, a responsibility to play our role in supporting democracy, free speech, a civic life. And I think wherever we sit, we need to do our part. If you sit in a corporate, ask your colleagues, ask your leadership why you're not doing more to drive towards a more just and sustainable planet. You want a good news story? We work closely with Unilever, who announced last year that they're going to pay a living wage to their first-tier employees in their supply chain, in their first tier. That's a great step forward, because for too long, global corporations have said, we'll look after our direct employees, but those who we outsource services to, they can just look after themselves. It's those sorts of things that we need to see much more of. If you happen to earn a lot of money, write to your MP and I'll call for higher taxes. Don't buy this line that we have to just sort of keep chipping away at the fiscal base.
Sure. Mark?
Well, look, I think to the journalists in the room, go and find those underreported stories and rebalance the news agenda. I think to the activists and campaigners and NGO leaders in the room, keep campaigning, because we are going to hit against a point where there will be a tipping point, change will come. Not just because of your campaigning, but because the level of pressure on the system will become irresistible. So get out there and get ready to shape the change. And to the business leaders in the room, you are a critical part of this. We criticize the COVID response, but the fact, and we criticize the profits made by pharma, but it was also a period of extraordinary invention at very high speed to provide vaccines. It's just a pity they didn't reach many parts of the world. So, there's a role for everybody. The combination of where we invest, how we innovate and who we innovate for, what we press for, what we vote for, and what we write about as journalists, all of that together moves the needle.
We like to say at RFK Human Rights, Bobby talked a lot about courageous leadership, and it's important, I guess, for all of us. That's what I'm hearing as a commonality, that if we want to see the world that we want our children to grow up in and their children to grow up in, it's going to take a lot of courageous leadership across different sectors, digging deep, being honest, transparent, and collaborating, because none of us can go it alone. So with that, Mark, Danny, thank you so much for the quick fire round conversation, and I just want to give a special thanks to Antonio and Julia and the entire team at Thomson Reuters Foundation for giving us this honor to be a part of this conference. So thank you very much.
Thank you.